In this session we'll be talking to Gayle McFarlane, an associate in the IT team. She'll be talking about online trading, and we'll be looking at the regulatory framework, what's different about doing business online, what information you need to provide to the people you do business with online, and what the differences are between trading with business to business and dealing with the consumer. So Gayle, I think this Christmas online sales beat shop sales for the first time. What are the key differences with online trading?
To be honest, there aren't too many, not as many as people might think anyway. There are some practical considerations that we need to think about, and there's also some legal points that are brought in by regulations in place for doing business online. But ultimately, all we're doing is changing the media in which we're transacting. And so we should really start from that starting point. How do you do business offline and translate that online? But we do have some sets of regulations which come into play and which really aim to level the playing field between the online and offline world. And so what they're trying to do is to make sure that we have confidence in the retailers that we're using online or the other suppliers that we're using online, but also that we have the same rights as we might have had if we were dealing in a shop if we're acting as a consumer.
Is there any specific information you must provide when online trading?
Primarily, the information is about the supplier. It's very, very simple. The rationale behind these obligations is so that customers know who you are. It's very difficult on the internet to have a certainty about who you're dealing with. And so the regulations are there to try and provide customer confidence. There's two sets of regulations which require information to be provided. The e-commerce directive requires that information to be provided in all commercial transactions online, so business to business as well as business to consumer. And then the distance selling regulations put in place additional information obligations for that business to consumer relationship. But again, the thrust is the same information. It's suppliers' addresses and details about them. In particular, they require a geographical address so that you could actually turn up on the doorstep if you really wanted to deal specifically with your supplier. But it also requires information to be clear about the products you're providing and the prices and any ancillary costs that might be associated with the sale in question. So if you have delivery costs, for example, and VAT and the like. So it's just really there to make sure that the consumer has enough information to make an informed decision about the purchase that they're going to make. There's quite a detailed list of the information that needs to be provided, and we've got access to that on our website compliance checklist, which is available on the website.
Well, we all know there's law and then there's real life. What are the practical considerations with online trading?
There really is, and so there are elements of the legal world which don't change because we're doing business online, but the way in which we might use them will change because we're doing business online. The first of those is in relation to intellectual property. It's important to bear in mind the speed at which the internet works and the speed at which information can spread. So you really want to think carefully about the content that you're providing online and what might happen to that, and how you can protect it. So there may be technical aspects that you might want to bring into play, digital rights management or encryption in relation to information that's being provided to purchasers of information. In addition, you might want to think about how your brand is protected when you're working online because of the speed at which information spreads and the way in which your brand is portrayed within social media. For example, can be really significant. So you might want to keep your eye on how that's working and how things are being represented within the online marketplace. Another aspect is in relation to data protection. Again, in relation to most of the data that we have online, there isn't a specific change in relation to doing business online. We do have in place the e-privacy regulations which govern how we carry out marketing by email, but all other aspects of data protection are the same. But personal information is one of the key assets that many online businesses have and can really be commercially leveraged when we're dealing online. It's really great that we gain a huge amount of information about our customers and that we're able to use that information to its best advantage when we're working online. So it's important to think about privacy and data protection right at the beginning stages of developing your website or your online product, so that you're able to build in privacy by design and deal appropriately with informing customers as to how you're going to be using their personal data. Because it's only by doing that that you're able to protect your future activities and make sure you can really get the best value out of the way in which you and your customers are interacting.
In terms of website content, what is personal data?
That's a really interesting question. Now, in terms of the normal content that you might put on, for example, a social networking website, there's an awful lot of content there that would be personal data. But ultimately, we have to go back to the Data Protection Act and consider the definition of personal data. What information do you have about the individual, and can you identify that individual from the data? That's the key issue you need to be thinking about first off. There are a number of debates that go around personal data and whether or not that information has biographical significance, for example, to the individual in question. But when we're designing websites and we're designing content, it's best really to think about personal data at its most basic level so that you're protecting more data rather than less. And that way you're more likely to have a more robust model going forward. So if you think you're collecting information which might identify somebody to you, then you ought to be treating that information and protecting it in the same way as you would do other personal data. There's other information though that's gathered online that people may not be quite so aware might be personal data. And for example, IP addresses may well in many contexts be personal data about the individual in question. So if your service collects IP addresses, you ought to be aware that that should be treated as personal information and protected in the same way.
We've heard about strictly necessary cookies. What is the issue with these and what are they?
Sure. I mean, cookies are small pieces of text that are downloaded onto your computer in order to help websites do their job and to give you the functionality that you're after. And they're really, really widespread. Most websites that you visit will use cookies of some description. Now, the new e-privacy directive required that those cookies be given consent, that you give consent before cookies are downloaded onto your computer, unless they're strictly necessary. Now, a cookie would be strictly necessary if, for example, it was required to keep the contents of your shopping basket whilst you were going around an online store, and so that when you clicked go to checkout, it still had those contents in the shopping basket at the time. But it wouldn't include other cookies which are there simply to store your user preferences, for example, how you prefer to use the website. Or more importantly, it wouldn't include analytical cookies which are there to track visitors as they move around your website and to give us important information about how popular our website might be and how we can best develop that website to the customer's advantage.
Can you talk me through the key differences between business to business, B2B, and business to consumer trading online?
There's a lot of talk about B2B and B2C when you're in the online world, and the first point to note is that the same differences apply in B2B and B2C offline and online in relation to the impact of consumer law. So there's a huge body of consumer law in the offline world that will still apply when you're dealing online. So you still have the same implied warranties and you still the same requirements for plain English, etc. that you would have if you were dealing offline. But we've got an additional level of distinction between business to business and business to consumer in the online world, and that's because of the distance selling regulations. They only apply if you're dealing with consumers. And they give consumers additional rights so that they can have the same experience shopping online as they might have had if they were shopping offline. And the key difference in relation to that is the right of cancellation. So if somebody's shopping online, they're able to receive the goods and have physical contact with those goods before they decide whether or not they want to keep it as a purchase. And so within 7 days of receiving those goods, they can decide to cancel the contract for the purchase and send them back. Now, obviously, that's not a right that's available in shops, although many shops do have discretionary return policies, which in essence give the same requirements. But it really is there to level the playing field, to encourage people to have the same confidence in shopping online as they do offline.
You've mentioned the distance selling regulations. I understand there's some reform of these coming up. What are going to be the headline changes here?
That's absolutely right. There's been a couple of sources of activity in this world, really, over the last couple of years. And the European Union have put in place a new Consumer Rights Directive, which is going to make some changes to the distance selling regulations as we have them in the UK. At the same time, the UK government is consulting on a consumer rights bill, which is going to look at similar issues around consolidating UK consumer law. But important things to bear in mind is that the Consumer Rights Directive will in fact increase some rights of the consumer to return the products along the lines of the cancellation policies that we've just spoken about. Now this would extend the period that they have to return products from 7 days to 14 days, which might seem quite significant for many businesses. The final requirement of the Consumer Rights Directive that's of particular interest is in relation to changes to regulations around surcharges. So these are the additional fees that you might charge if people are paying by various types of payment mechanisms, so credit cards or otherwise. Now, the regulations require that those cannot be any more than the actual cost of making the transaction to the supplier. And that change is going through the UK statute books as we speak and should be enforced in April of this year.
What happens if you don't comply with the distance selling regulations?
That's a really interesting question. Now, the key issue is that you're going to suffer reputational harm if that causes a problem to consumers. Now, ultimately, unless somebody finds out that you're not complying, there's probably not going to be any action. But if what you're doing is restricting consumers' rights to gain access, for example, to cancellation opportunities, then you're likely to find that complaints will be made. And those complaints can be made to trading standards, but also to the OFT, who are able to take action against retailers who are not complying. And they do take action. We deal with a number of complaints made against retailers by the OFT for failure to comply with the distance selling regulations. And one of the interesting things that we find is that you may have one aspect that is non-compliant, and you can find that the OFT can actually require that the rest of your terms and conditions also be made more consumer friendly in order to let you off that one transgression. And so you can actually find that by being non-compliant in one aspect, your whole set of terms and conditions may need to be rewritten, which may have an impact on the way in which you do business. But reputation is one of the biggest issues in relation to non-compliance. And apart from name and shame activities by the regulators, there's also the issue of the viral effect, the spread of word of mouth from consumers who feel hard done by not having their full statutory rights online.
Well, Gayle, that's very interesting. I just hope if anyone's listening online, they don't ask for a refund.
Thank you.